Hello and good evening, all. Welcome to the tea house. This is your hopefully calm and humble host, Bilal. Today's just going to be a discussion video where I share my unsolicited opinions and ramblings with you all. If you're not interested in hearing anything political today, please feel free to turn off the video and watch something that's more appealing. Always take care of yourself. Today I'm going to be discussing, quite frankly, I would say just fascism, or the hyper-authoritarianism that comes, therefore. The right-wing movements, well, let's get a little bit of maybe some background information. Fascism, of course, is a child of Marx. Now, to understand fascism, you have to read Marxist ideology, which some people may get angry at, but that is quite literally true. Reading Oswald Mosley's 101 Questions About Fascism Answered, and of course, it's very hard to pin down what exactly is fascism because it's such a sporadic ideology, I would say. But I think the simplest way of saying it would be either what Mussolini said, which would be everything within the state and nothing without the state, roughly, I believe is what he said. And also it is an individual group of people, so industrialists and strongmen, military leaders, seizing the means of production, quote, on behalf of the people. And that's corporatism. Essentially, that's what fascism is just corporatism, which means that the government is in control. But beyond that, it also gets into the myth of a fictional, mythical age, essentially. Something that this existed in the past and we're reclaiming it. For Italy, it was Rome. They were trying to reclaim the glory of Rome. And for Germany, it was essentially trying to reclaim a lost Germanic golden age, which of course is even more ridiculous, as Germany was nothing without Semitic literacy, which I'm not knocking like ancient Germanic history or saying they're an inferior people. I'm just saying that the entirety of their ethos in the modern age is built off of Semitic literacy. But, I digress either way. And when you discuss fascism, or if you even get into Nazism, really, the end goal of fascism is the state itself, which Nazis would differ in that, and they would say, like, the end goal of the state is the race, or the preservation, therefore, of some kind of race, which isn't even uniquely a German thing. There are Nazi parties in other parts of the world, like Mongolia, for example, whose headquarters, the last time I read about this, was about a lingerie shop, which is quite funny to me personally, but they also do Lorax activities against Chinese mining companies, so think about that what you will. But the point being is fascism always needs some kind of enemy to destroy in order to bring about this golden age again. And it wasn't just a European thing. There's also in America there was the business plot in the 40s, or I believe maybe in the 30s, where people, including Trump's grandfather, who was aware of this, tried to take over the United States government in a Mussolini black shirt style way. And before and at around the same time, there was also the Silver Shirts, or the Silver Legion, which was the original American Christian nationalist, racist, fascist party. And they were outlawed during the Second World War and placed in prison. And I did earlier mention Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Although personally, from reading what he wrote, it reminds me more of syndicalism, which is quite funny because in the video game Kaiserreich. He actually is the leader of a syndicalist Britain in alternate history. But I believe the MAGA movement itself to be more reminiscent of some kind of bastard child of the Silver Legion, classical corporatism, and the ideas of George Lincoln Rockwell. Rockwell, of course, eventually being murdered by a member of his own party, who he, of course, had forced out of the party, which is just characteristic of the chaotic nature of right-wing politics. They really have nothing that brings them together besides hate of an other, which is a characteristic of fascism in itself. Again, they need a enemy to destroy in order to bring about the rebirth of a nation. For the Nazis and the Italians, it was the communists and the Jews. Of course, today the MAGA movement has its hatred and, Muslims, transgender people, immigrants of all stripes. That appears to be their grand enemy, although it does seem they have a hyperfixation on transgender people. But the enemy always needs to be, at the same time, incredibly weak, but at the same time, extremely powerful. It needs to be that paradoxical duality in order to be the perfect boogeyman to rile up an uneducated and ignorant mass against the enemy in order to control them. Because, and I don't mean this to be mean, I just believe that most people aren't that smart. The saying, of course, is that a person is smart, but people are violent and stupid. But people and in these right-wing circles are essentially just manipulated. There are actually quite not that many few people who are genuinely evil and racist. Most people, it's just the mundanity of cruelty. People are aware horrible things happen, but as long as it doesn't happen to them and the trains run on time, then there really isn't anything they're going to worry about at that exact moment. Of course, eventually, these people who are not worried about anything because it's not happening to them will, because of the nature of this beast that is fascist ideology, eventually the purity spiral will reach them and they will find themselves in the position of despised minority. But the MAGA movement, as most fascist movements I've stated, have the characteristics of the mythical past that needs to be brought about by a social rebirth that can only be brought about by destroying a perceived or imagined foe that is both at the same time extremely strong but also extremely weak. Because they need to be portrayed as the hero destroying the foe in order to bring about a rebirth of the society. But of course, fascist societies either decay entirely because they're a society of entirely civilization. They are not a society of culture. In fact, they pervert and bastardize culture to the point where it doesn't even function in the way it's supposed to. Fascist art, of course, is not truly art unless it's being subversive in some kind of way. The human spirit, of course, is individualistic at its core, and what that means is that people do not want to be controlled and put in the box. And the MAGA movement plays off of the fear that the left-wing people are going to put you in the box and make you eat the bugs, which of course is ridiculous. But they need that idea so they can portray themselves as the saviors of their idea of their society. or their society. Of course, also economic situations can bring about authoritarianism in the way that when people are deprived of creature comforts, they are going to look for somebody to blame. And when it came again to Germany, specifically, the idea of the Jewish question was a big idea in continental Europe, not just Germany, although they get the blame for a lot of it. The Jews, of course, being their own people, and the idea that they could never assimilate into German society, of course, because they had their own law. Where have we heard that before? And we, of course, can talk about Governor Abbott of Texas, who is, of course, just the continuation of the Jim Crow South, which people have the idea that, oh, the civil rights amendments are passed and suddenly the South is not fundamentally racist and white supremacist to its core. Of course it is. And people do not change that quickly, especially when it comes to culture. And don't the MAGA movement have a perfect enemy in the Muslim Americans? Of course, we have our own laws and our own religion and our own customs, and we, of course, cannot be assimilated into this perfect Aryan America. I'm being hyperbolic of the use of Aryan. Of course, very little people in the MAGA movement would actually use that. It more or less comes down to more of a chauvinistic, neoliberal society with heavy authoritarian undertones. Although lately they have been using Christianity in a very perverted way. And I mean that in the strictest sense of the word. It's perverting the idea of Christianity into this Machiavellian cult that they've created around Trump and his, of course, martyrs, being, of course, the late Mr. Charlie Kirk, who I have my own opinions on. I do not believe he was a good person. This video isn't about him. I believe he wasn't given the opportunity to be better, and that 31 years wasted on hate and arguing with college students, quite actually a meaningless life. It's quite sad. It's quite sad indeed, and I feel bad for his children because they have lost their father, and that's really the end of that particular segment. Now, to return to a thought I was having and I was sharing with you all, I believe that the MAGA movement is more in line with George Rockwell's ideology than the ideology of Mussolini, although it is quite a hodgepodge of Frankenstein's monster. Rockwell was not necessarily an economist. He was not an economist. That's what I meant to say. He was just a very racist gentleman who had this idea of what he would call like Aryan, Aryan industry or Aryan industrialism. And what he meant by that was he wanted to take away, quote, the parasitic aspects of capitalism and replace them with essentially what can be described as some kind of ridiculous notion of the American Main Street, kind of like his entire ethos can be described, and that he wanted the United States to be a very darker version of Leave It to Beaver. And at its core, that's really what the MAGA movement is. It's a movement of nostalgia for an America that certainly never existed, or not in the way that they're remembering it. The experience of people who are not in the majority within American society, they do not, remember it as Leave It to Beaver. I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, but also around the same time I was reading the memoirs of the late President Carter, very much, although he did recognize things were not as good as they could have been, very much were living around the same time and had very different experiences in life during the same time periods. But, digressing to where I would say that they're nostalgic for an America that never existed, and that itself is the mythical past they're trying to resurrect, where everybody was perfect and there was nothing wrong with society, quote unquote. Of course, we did go through our social revolutions in the 70s and 60s, and society is quite different, but people were still people back then, and of course, society was not good for everybody. I mean, why do you think the Motorist Green Book had to exist? To just protect people who are going to have to travel through states that did not see them as human beings. Of course, America never got over its, quote, original sin of institutional racism and slavery, which that is a whole other subject to really talk about. But I think deeply the backlash of right-wing America comes from, or it's not even right-wing America, that's not a real thing. It's just the backlash of, I'd say, white America, which makes up the majority of the MAGA movement, although you will find token individuals who are from various groups, including Muslims. You'll find some of us who will side with them in a performative kind of way, and either way, they desperately want to be seen as a victim in this society. And I believe it may stem from the fact that left-wing, ideologues in America have completely ignored the white working class to the point where they're demonized as a boogeyman. Solidarity among the intelligentsia does not necessarily exist. And what I mean by that specifically is these fascist movements are able to grow from being parasitic off the white working class. Essentially, instead of them being shepherded, because that's not to be demeaning, that's just a way I would describe moving mass amounts of people into a more class-conscious way of thinking. They're essentially, someone comes to them after the blue-haired individual has been screaming about how they're evil and their entire way of life must die and that they're privileged, going to a man who can barely feed his children and saying he's privileged. Believe me, I've seen Americans act like this. I had a conversation with somebody who talked about how privileged the people in Serbia were. She was living in Serbia, which is not a third world country, or I guess maybe not technically, but it's not the richest country, And she's like, oh, the people in Serbia are so privileged compared to me because I'm African American, and they'll know. And I'm like, that's the kind of ridiculousness that's allowed fascism and these fascist movements to parasitically grow off the white working class. Essentially, they've been told they're boogeymen, and these hyper-authoritarian capitalists who may or may not actually have a genuine belief in this mythical past, or they could just be profiting off of the ignorance and the anger of the working class and trying to bring about the end of the American Republic for greed and for power, which is a little bit of Occam's razor there. It's probably the latter. But the white working class parasitically has been attached. They've attached onto the white working class parasitically and convinced them that it's the transgender people and the immigrants and the other that is the problem. It's the people with their own law and their own religion. They're not like you. And obviously, I have all the cookies. That joke is they have that there's the businessman with all of the cookies, and then this man has one cookie, and then looking at a man with no cookies, he's like, he wants your cookie. You have to defend yourself. Of course, that's what we're dealing with. honestly, there is that, and then there is actually the disintegration of unity among the white Americans that has led to this point. Um, in the past, that solidarity among white Americans was a given, um, or in some cases, there were immigrant communities that had their own solidarity who essentially sold that to become white just in time for that to essentially become meaningless. In the South, it was easy for the, of course, the white working class or the agrarian class. They might have had nothing, but at least they weren't black, and that's what it took to convince them to fight a civil war on the behalf of wealthy capitalistic slaveholders. So the rise, I believe, of this weird neo-fascist ideology has to do with the backlash, I believe, against the more, I won't even say radical, because it's not radical in the sense that it's bringing about good and positive and needed change. What I mean is in the sense of a very performative type of activist that simply existed to demonize the white working class and to provoke people. And of course, the right wing also do this provocateur culture that we have of hate likes is quite profitable for some people. Social media might also exacerbate that a bit. Um, Beyond that, there's the economic terms and the disintegration of the status of whiteness as a commodity or something to be achieved or reached to in American society. Simply, we are dealing at the point where people are realized they were subconsciously realizing it, that just because you are white does not guarantee that you are going to be better off than, say, an immigrant or a person of color, or an other. And they're angry subconsciously that they were sold that idea and now they can't achieve that, which of course is not the fault of the other. It's the fault of the system that has tricked them and has parasitically attached itself to them. Of course, then we would need to get to the other side of the MAGA movement, which is the evangelical Christians, or a broader umbrella of various Christian groups that exist within the United States that essentially would make up the religious right. They might, in some cases, I believe that they are genuine in their belief that they want to make America a quote better place. What I mean by that is I believe that they believe that. I believe that they think that what they're doing is right. But it's more of a performative, not genuine type of Christianity that is there. In fact, the entirety of the religious right in America, there are probably people there who would genuinely believe what they're doing is for their faith. However, I believe subconsciously, if not blatantly, they worship an idol of Western chauvinism. They essentially do not care about religion. More or less, they only care about the orthodox outward showing, therefore, of religion. So they want to be seen being religious, but they don't actually live or go into an inward path of spirituality. They do not care about spirituality. They care about religion, which of course is disgusting and ridiculous. You sit there and you go to an altar or you spasm on the floor and speak in tongues, and that's religion. I guess my ethos is a bit different. As a Muslim, we engage civically as part of our religious expression. So maybe the idea that you can compartmentalize your religion into going on Sunday and you know, shouting praise the Lord and then immediately screaming at an underpaid immigrant waitress on a Sunday breakfast. I cannot compartmentalize my faith in the way that I see evangelicals do that, and not even forgetting that the legacy of their religious expression itself is built on racism. There is a reason that there are black churches and that there are white churches in America, you know, and we have the same thing in the regards that there are usually masjids that have different majority ethnicities, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be looked at weird if you go there to pray. But, this isn't me proselytizing or comparing religion. I don't even believe that these people are genuine expressions of Christianity. They are a far cry from the Orthodox Christians I know and the Roman Catholics I know, the genuine religious people who actually live Christianity are not the same people who talk about how Charlie Kirk is the 13th apostle, which wouldn't that make him Judas? But that's neither here nor there. I guess what I don't like about MAGA people is that they are idol worshippers and that they aren't intelligent and that they are easily manipulated and that they are violent. Although I can understand that the majority of them are being manipulated, as I said, and I do believe that the majority of them would not even be considered actual conscious participators in a MAGA movement. They're more or less working class people who have been parasitically attached to a very, very, very dangerous ideology that only seeks to uplift the capitalists, to maintain the quasi garden of the rich that has become the United States. Really, quite literally, the fear of these people, and I'm not speaking the MAGA movement, the fear of the ultra-rich here is that they will be made uncomfortable. Of course, maybe somebody gets so rich they start to believe in their own hype. But this is kind of just a random kind of rant. I didn't even get into Japanese fascism when I was discussing that. Of course, that's a whole different idea, and it's not even necessarily fascism as more as it is just militarism, so in the same way as Franco, who was not a fascist, by the way, although people say it. Fascism is an actual ideology. But I believe what we're dealing with within the United States itself is more or less a quasi-authoritarian, religious, racial hodgepodge of ideas that doesn't really have any concrete unity besides the fact that they think they know what Western civilization, they don't know what Western civilizations is, but they're quite sure on what it isn't, and that is that they don't want to see any brown people or people of color, or that's really what it comes down to. They want to live in a demented episode of Leave It to Beaver. And that's been my quite little rant. I may not even upload this episode of my ramblings, but we'll see. Anyways, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you if you're still here, and thank you all. This has been Belial Tios. Have a good evening.